I am a big Milton Friedman fan, and I've mentioned him several times on this channel, but I don't think I've ever mentioned Milton's most outstanding, charismatic, and in my view, influential protege, Thomas Sowell. Well, I'm going to rectify that omission right now. I am the proud owner of the Free to Choose TV series hosted by Milton Friedman back in the 1980s. I know, very boomer of me. But even with everything I've seen since I entered the YouTube universe, I can't think of a better video presentation for free market lovers looking to understand and, if necessary, argue the basics of capitalism. It's available now on Amazon Prime. Perhaps someday it will be available on a forum that isn't evil. Now, I probably have watched these episodes 5 or 10 times, but I remember the very first time that I watched them. You get about halfway through this series, and all of a sudden, there is this electrifying young black man who seems to come out of nowhere to absolutely dominate this series, more so even than its famous host. My first, second, and third thoughts were, who the hell is this guy? This, of course, was Thomas Sowell.
I may have all sorts of expectations. The question is, what can I do? If someone else is subsidizing my expectations will be far higher. Insofar as the Center for Advanced Study was subsidizing my expectations a few years ago, I refused to work at UCLA for the normal full professor's salary. Why should I when I can get the same money for being at the Center for Advanced Study with no hours, no duties, and no classes?
I mean, look at him. He seems so perfectly comfortable among the anti-free market piranha Friedman invited on the show to express their opinions, so sure of himself. And he was so utterly convincing, I don't see how anybody watching that series could come away from it doubting a word that he said. Thomas Sowell has had and continues to have a career that almost defies imagination in its scale and its breadth. He has written 30 books, written for or appeared on a list of stations and publications too numerous to mention. He is that rare intellectual these days that actually uses his intellect and is absolutely the quintessential free market scholar, advocate, and spokesperson. Thomas Sowell was a communist, a devout adherent of Karl Marx when Sowell was in his 20s, when all philosophy is abstract, and the universal equality soundbite from Marxism sounds conveniently attractive. Sowell came to embrace communism not while sitting in a Starbucks drinking $6 lattes and complaining about his course load, but while riding the bus back and forth from Manhattan to Harlem and seeing the enormous wealth disparities that existed then as they still do now. As Mr. Sowell said, Marx, quote, took the overwhelming complexity of the real world and made the parts fall into place in a way that was intellectually exhilarating. The seeds of Mr. Sowell's eventual awakening were evident even then, as he read economic conservatives like William F. Buckley and Edmund Burke and other free market advocates, even as he remained a Marxist. For a number of years, Mr. Sowell self-identified as a Marxist. That is until he had his first real-world experience with the state. In the summer of 1960, Mr. Sowell went to work for the U.S. Department of Labor and learned, to his astonishment, that the data was telling him the minimum wage was hurting the poor instead of helping them. When he brought this data to his superiors, to his astonishment, again, they couldn't have cared less. Why? Because the continuance of their jobs and their livelihoods depended on their administration of the minimum wage law. As Sowell says, administration of the minimum wage law was a major portion of the Department of Labor budget and employed a significant fraction of the people who worked there. Whether or not minimum wages benefited workers may have been my overriding question, but clearly it was not theirs. As a former government worker myself, I cover this phenomenon in another segment on this channel. To Mr. Sowell, his experience in the Department of Labor was the beginning of the end for his Marxist beliefs, causing him to rethink the larger question of the role of government in general. The more government programs I looked into, the harder I found it to believe that they were a net benefit to society. But there's one anecdote from Sowell's past that, to me at least, perfectly encapsulates the qualities that separate Sowell, as well as a few others, from their contemporaries today. Sowell was having some financial difficulties. He had a very challenging early life, and he was applying for a grant from the Earhart Foundation, a prestigious think tank that would ultimately produce 9 Nobel Prize winners. That the chairman of the foundation received a recommendation letter from Milton Friedman and future Nobel Prize winner George Stigler, in which they recommended that the foundation accept Sowell's grant proposal. Here's how Richard Ware, then head of the Earhart Foundation, summarized the recommendation letter. They nominated him for the fellowship, and they said he's a socialist, but he's too smart to remain one for long. That was the way they put it to the trustees. The idea that any of today's intellectuals could accept a truth based merely on incontrovertible data that conflicted with their preconceptions is so ridiculous as to be inconceivable. They are utterly unable to separate their emotional attachment to irrational preconceptions from objective, thorough, and voluminous data, proving that their preconceptions are wrong and that they need to change their minds. Their emotional attachment to these preconceptions completely overwhelms their logical faculty so that they remain anchored, as though in concrete, to ideas and policies that are provably wrong and provably catastrophic to the very parties that they claim to want to help. On the other hand, Mr. Sowell's journey from communism to capitalism was, in essence, over before it ever began for one simple reason. He refused to ignore facts that conflicted with his preconceptions. He was interested only in finding the truth through verifiable independent data. And if the information that he discovered during the course of his journey disproved his preconceptions, he cast those preconceptions aside like a pair of old shoes, with hardly a second thought. I mentioned before that Mr. Sowell had a difficult early life. He came north to Harlem shortly after the death of his father in North Carolina. After qualifying for a prestigious academic high school in New York, he was forced to drop out because of financial problems at home. He worked in a machine shop, later as a delivery man, before he was drafted and became a Marine. Growing up in the 50s and 60s, it goes without saying, Mr. Sowell faced his share of discrimination, and yet, here's what he has to say when asked about so-called systemic racism in America today. It's one of many words that I don't think even the people who use it have any clear idea of what they are saying. It is a propaganda tactic that must be repeated loud enough and long enough until anyone who resists the message caves into it. Thomas Sowell has been a passionate defender of free markets for most of his adult life. At a spry 91 years old, he continues to probe and question and test in an effort to further hone his already towering intellect. He never accepts a truth on face value, and he never rejects a hypothesis without good reason. This is thinking in its purest sense, where thoughts backed up by objective evidence and reason are accepted as true until proven otherwise, becoming the basis for productive action. Thoughts not supported by facts are not discarded, but put aside as a driver for action until or unless they merit re-examination. I think of Thomas Sowell as sort of the Muhammad Ali of the intellectual world. Politics aside, intellectual prowess aside, you could not fail to notice Ali in his prime. He had a personal magnetism and a command of his craft that demanded your attention and simply would not let you look away. Mr. Sowell will be 92 in June. I hope to continue to be entranced by him and his ideas for many, many years to come.
What the welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail. Insofar as they fail, they receive the money. Insofar as they succeed, even to a moderate extent, the money is taken away. This is even extended into the school systems, where they will give money to schools with low scores. Insofar as the school improves its education, the money is taken away, so that you are subsidizing people to fail in their own private lives and become more dependent upon the handouts.